Hello, everyone. I'm Ivo Daalder, president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and this is World Review, our weekly look at news from around the world. And joining us today from Washington, D.C. is Susan Glasser, staff writer for The New Yorker. Susan, great to have you back.
Thank you.
And also from the District of Columbia, Ed Luce, who is the U.S. national editor and a columnist for the Financial Times. Ed, great to see you again.
Delighted to be here, Ivo.
And from across the pond, as they like to say, in Britain, James Harding, co-founder and editor of Tortoise Media. James, wonderful to have you back here as well.
Thanks, Ivo.
Lots of things happening today, but the weirdest story, James, let's start with that, is this diversion, I think is what it's called, of an airplane, a Ryanair flight from Greece to Vilnius that all of a sudden landed because of a supposed bomb threat in Minsk, Belarus. And from then it went from weird to even weirder. What should we make of this strange hijacking that happened? And how do you think we should judge how the rest of the international community is responding to this?
So weird and even weirder is right. I thought of it really as very scary and then deeply scary. So the very scary is the idea that you can get on a commercial jet. Ryanair, as you know, in Europe is like a, JetBlue or an Alaskan Airlines. You get on it and you think, right, off you go, watch a movie, have a drink. And then you get, for reasons that are almost impossible to understand, brought down with the false claim that there's a bomb on board and escorted by a MiG to an airport, Minsk. Just personally, if you imagine what that does to public confidence in air travel, it changes the way in which we think about our own security, from having worried for years now about security as we go through airports to actually security over certain nations and their airspace. So I think there's something personal about this. But I think that why I think it's deeply scary is that I think there's a pattern here where countries that are, if you like, in the umbrella of Putin's Russia operate to a certain worldview. And if you like, 20 odd years ago, we began to think more deeply about asymmetric warfare. You might say 40 years ago. We're now beginning to think about state vandalism of the world order. So Saudi and Khashoggi, or Putin's killing of former spies or attempts to kill former spies in Salisbury, and then what you've seen in Minsk and Lukashenko is what you're seeing is we don't need to obey the rules of the air. Right? We're going to actually rip up one of the very few things that really helps the world work, which is that we all abide by a shared sense of security in the air. And there's something there that is hugely damaging to the possibility of the world operating properly, but it also, I think, reinforces this idea that we're moving into an age of these power blocks, and the ragged Russian power bloc is one of those, because the response of the EU has actually been quite coordinated, but it's been met by opposition from the Russians, and Russians in alliance with Belarus. So I think that there is something here which is personally frightening, but actually much more deeply frightening to anyone who cares about how you run world affairs.
Susan, James really makes two really, I think, great points. Aside from the personal issue, and no one ever thought that you get on an airplane that it would be taken down in a different place, other than for good safety reasons. On the one hand, this idea that a whole bunch of rogue gangsters are just doing stuff that was just unheard of and breaking the rules. I think David Miliband, former Foreign Secretary of the UK, calls this the age of impunity. That people can get away with the weirdest and scariest stuff. And then secondly, this idea that we're merging into two blocks in which there is a disorder, people who are going against the rules, but also people who are trying to enforce the rules. How do you see it?
Well, I noticed earlier in the week, Ivo, that you were tweeted that notion of the age of impunity, and I also thought it was an appealing frame for trying to understand. Essentially, this is where I think there's some commonality that goes outside of the kind of regional block frame, which is to say, to go to a broader notion that for all of the reasons we've talked about many times, technological innovation, fragmentation, that you're dealing with a world where dictators like Lukashenko are hyper empowered in some ways. And frankly, we've seen uses of aspects of that playbook here inside the United States as well by Donald Trump and his followers. And I would say that it comes down to not just impunity and the relative sense that you can get away with things, but also the calculated use of the unthinkable. And that is something that we've seen here in our politics, obviously. And it tends to, really, people are deeply conventional, and, whether it's large institutions like our foreign policy establishments, here in the US or in Europe, they don't know how to deal with the shock and the unthinkable. Now, I think that Europe's reaction, as James pointed out, was quite coordinated, and I was interested to see that they moved swiftly, by the way. And it tells you that the sclerotic, slow decision-making process, generally when it's come to challenges from Belarus and Russia, don't have to be that way. And I think that's part of the problem, is that our responses to authoritarian misdeeds tend to be not nearly as creative, fast, innovative, or therefore forceful as the actions themselves. And, we've seen that Putin, of course, has long been a master of what I would call calculated unpredictability, right? And he did that in Crimea, for example, in 2014 is kind of the biggest example of it. But what was he doing with those 110,000 troops that, have been put on the border with Ukraine? He was giving himself, creating the conditions whereby he might then do something, very shocking or unpredictable. And so with Belarus, the other thing I wanted to spotlight, of course, is that in a way, this could end up being a terrible backfire moment for Lukashenko, right? Because I think one thing is that he's gotten away largely with Russia's patronage, with something really horrible, which is to say, not only stealing an election, he's an expert at that. Little known footnote, I spent September 9th, 2001, and September 10th, 2001 in Belarus, where the last dictator in Europe, Alexander Lukashenko, was busy rigging an election and beating the heck out of the Democrat small d who tried to oppose him. Flash forward 20 years later, he's no longer the last dictator in Europe, unfortunately, but he is still in power. And, he's gotten away with an incredible crackdown and repression. And, the United States has done nothing. And now he inserts himself in the global conversation in a very provocative way, just weeks before a summit meeting between Joe Biden and Vladimir Putin that many people in Washington, including in Biden's own administration, are very skeptical about and concerned that it sends exactly the wrong message to Putin at a moment when he's been engaging in a lot of provocative acts. And so to me, the question is, did Lukashenko just put himself right on the agenda of US-Russia's relationship in a way that is certainly not going to redound to Lukashenko's benefit?
A lot there, Ed, from what Susan is saying. One of the things, and I love this phrase of the calculated, unthinkable or unpredictability that we've seen as part of this. The Biden administration kind of came in thinking that this unthinkability was tied to a singular person, Donald Trump, and that if you could go back to that earlier era. The first Secretary of State really talks about the rules-based order and the need to defend that. And yet, if we live in an age of impunity or of calculated unpredictability, and where in fact violating the rules is the point, how to think about responding to that really is critical. And I'm not sure the administration's kind of figured out. How do you see that?
Well, it's a very, very germane question, but it's also a very complicated one. The sanctions that the EU imposed on Belarus were presumably factored in by Lukashenko. Presumably, he wouldn't have undertaken this kind of state-sponsored hijacking without at least some kind of implicit go-ahead from Moscow. You know, we are talking about an internal EU flight, an intra-EU flight from Athens to Vilnius that is just clipping his airspace and then forced down. That's, for a small country like Belarus, not something you do to this giant neighbor unless you think you've got the backing of another giant neighbor, namely Russia. So the question is, will these sanctions do anything? Will they deter other countries from trying to do this? And I think that is an open question. I don't think that these are particularly biting sanctions. Of course, there could be more further down the line. The larger issue of how to control state-sponsored renditions all over the world, or assassinations all over the world, should include the perspective that countries that are doing this, like Russia, like China, like Saudi Arabia, and so on, and Israel, the perspective they have on the United States, which is that the United States has been conducting renditions since the War on Terror for many years, that it has carried out assassinations by drone of terrorists, but sometimes collateral damage and sometimes the wrong target. And that even though there is a very big difference between the rule of law in the United States and all these other countries, which don't have the rule of law ultimately, it's pretty easy to blur those in a propaganda message to say, what rules-based international order are you talking about? Since you yourselves only adhere to it when it suits you. So I think this airline hijacking, if you like, there's been plenty in the past. The airlines have been, a colleague of mine, Victor Mallet, had his airline, his flight when he was 11 in 1971. He was flying from London to Khartoum and it was forced to land in Libya. 2 Libyans were taken off the plane and executed. So there's it's not so much a newfangled threat, this, as a fairly well-established one from the past, from decades past. It's happened before. I think the real challenge is drones and other kinds of modern technology that countries like China are developing. The United States, reserves the right to carry out drone attacks anywhere in the world where there is a threat to a terrorist threat to America. What are the rules that say China can't do the same, or Saudi Arabia can't do the same, or Israel can't do the same? We don't really have the beginnings of a sort of Geneva Protocol on this issue. And I hope this fairly old-fashioned state-sponsored sort of act of piracy might encourage us to look to the newfangled ones and start drawing up new rules-based systems to replace the very leaky one that we've got now.
Yeah, and I'd add cyber as another angle to not having rules and being able to do stuff as we saw with Colonial Pipeline and others. James, jump in here.
Ed, I really don't. I almost always agree with what you say, and I almost then always, basically nick your ideas and pass them off as my own. But I really don't agree with you on this because, firstly, let's remember that case, the case of the plane that was brought down in Benghazi 50 years ago, was brought down by Gaddafi. And it was a kind of not just act of piracy, it was the statement of a pariah. What we're seeing now is that pariah behavior, to use Susan's phrase, this calculated use of the unthinkable, is becoming an MO for more and more countries that want to get a certain set of issues on their agenda, or essentially prosecute a domestic agenda within international airspace or in international territory. So I don't think that the Benghazi example suggests, we've got something that's got a long history here. I think this is spreading. The second thing is I'm really uncomfortable with the equivalence that is drawn, I know, but by China or Russia or other countries that says, the US has been involved in, state-sponsored renditions for years. The Khashoggi case and obviously the Belarus case, these are journalists that have been brought down. And the reason why I think Ivo's point about David Miliband's age of impunity is so significant here is that Miliband's argument is we can see the age of impunity. We can see that you can get away with it. Historically, there have been, I think, what he calls countervailing measures, that there were systems that worked. And I suppose the bit that I do agree with that you say is that we're going to have to step in with much more forceful countervailing measures. There's an interesting thing that's happened this week, which is that the EU, by the EU standards, is really getting its act together. It's much more coordinated on finance post-COVID, it's much more coordinated on travel and COVID certificates itself, and it's been more coordinated in these sanctions. The question I've got is whether or not the West really, really works together now and says, look, when Russia starts stopping planes because they don't fly over Belarus airspace, does the US stand behind the EU? And there's a coordinated approach now to the respect of the rule of law in the air.
I don't want to give you an opportunity
Very
to.
quickly, I agree with everything you said. I was not posing equivalence between the United States and countries like China and Russia, but I was saying it's very easy for them to make that blurred argument. And to the extent that that then produces a response such as the one you made, this is a good debate to be having, because we need to upgrade these rules and understand what they are. So we're kind of in agreement.
Great. Well, actually, I don't know. Is it good to be in agreement on this show? It's good. It's good to have light. That's the good thing, Susan.
Yeah, no, I think this is an important conversation, but the impunity, remember, I do think this is where I get back to this being, is it a regional threat or a global one, I think is an important question without a definitive answer, because frankly, Vladimir Putin has already been running versions of this play, but lower tech versions, and essentially has used the UK as a killing field, as in addition to Germany. In recent years, you've seen, essentially, reaching outside of the country or even the region in order to do his own version of not renditions, but, taking banned, deadly, lethal substances and using them on the territory of the UK. Diplomats had to beg Donald Trump to even do the minimum about that. I don't think it was a successful deterrent. And so again, my question is this essentially, should we see Belarus and Lukashenko here acting in concert with Russia in a way that represents perhaps an extension of the existing problems with Russia and Russia's threat? Or is it kind of a harbinger of a broader global unraveling and fraying of things that would then incorporate, out of control drone warfare, out of control use of multiple countries attacking civil aviation, things like that. And, right, the center cannot hold, like we're always on the verge of unraveling. The question is what's unraveling at the moment. And I don't know the answer to that yet, but I do think that in going back to kind of practical, what's going to happen next, I think the question I have actually does come back to the last comments here, Ed, which is, what is the United States going to do about it? And that's where I do look at the timing on this. And I think that it is very significant. What I'm told, so Putin and Biden have agreed to meet in Geneva on the 16th of June. What is the agenda for this summit? We don't even know. It's very unclear. I've had many of the new Biden officials, as I'm sure others have on this call, express great skepticism that there even is a positive agenda with Russia at this moment that's worthwhile. I mean, there is the restarting of the Iran nuclear talks and rejoining the nuclear deal is one thing. Climate change might be another, and the Arctic. But we saw wildly divergent views, frankly, from the U.S. and Russia on issues like the Arctic. In the recent meeting between Secretary of State Tony Blinken and Lavrov. So my question is, okay, this is a summit meeting without an agenda. The Biden team has made clear they don't have much hope of any positive dealings with Russia, and frankly seem to be doing this just as its own way of containing it. But is a meeting in this day and age really a sufficient way of putting the Russia problem back in a box so that they can execute their planned pivot to Asia. And I remain dubious of that, especially because Putin is under so much domestic pressure right now. And, look, we're not talking about Alexei Navalny on this conversation right now. We're not talking about the sustainability of Vladimir Putin's rule. Once again, for 20 years, I've seen him run versions of this play, and it works.
Every time.
It works.
Susan, can I just ask you, or Ivo, I don't know who to ask really this question, which is, are there people in DC thinking that that Biden is devaluing the value of a bilateral meeting with the president of the United States? Because Navalny, Ukraine, solar winds, Belarus, are there not people saying, does it make sense for the US president to have a bilateral meeting with the president of Russia right now?
Yes. There are people saying that, absolutely, including, I think, some people inside the administration. However, first of all, we're dealing in the post-Trump presidency, and Trump having sort of blown up a lot of, ways of thinking about diplomacy here. I think there's a wider latitude for Biden to do something like this without the second guessing that might normally come publicly, at least. So there's more private second guessing. Second of all, I think there is a view that Biden, in a different way than Trump, but still believes in, he's a guy who's a sort of personal diplomacy, like, yeah, don't worry about me. I'm not going to sell us out. And so let me at him, I'm happy to speak truth power. And I think people aren't that scared that Biden is going to, make some big concession or something as a result of this. And so, the frame around it is different, but, absolutely, that's the critique of it. I think what I heard from a senior Biden official the other day, and I'm still trying to process this because I don't know what I think about it, was basically, we've concluded reluctantly that this is more or less the price we have to pay. Certain amount of personal attention from our very senior officials and the president himself on Putin and on Russia in order to not have it blow up into a bigger problem. And that was what I heard. It was not a very compelling case, perhaps said not with the full zeal of this official, but that was what they could come up with. So you guys tell me what you make of that. I'm actually really curious what everybody on this conversation thinks about that as a rationale for this meeting.
Well, I want to move on, and we'll come back to the actual summit as we go along. I mean, my sense is that Biden is trying to put some stability in the relationship, and if that means, and so I kind of buy that. I don't know whether this was the right way to do it, and you might have done it on the at the margin of another meeting rather than having something that you will call a summit. I would ban the word summit, by the way, from this conversation, and call it just a meeting. But I want to move on to the next piece, and just to tie a bow on the last conversation on Belarus and the importance of countervailing pressure. It is going to be very interesting to see what the International Civil Aviation Organization, this obscure yet founded at the time of even before the UN organization based in Canada, that actually governs the rules of the road about where people fly. They have, in an emergency meeting, have now said they're going to investigate this, and they will report by June 25th, which is probably the fastest that any international organization has done anything, assuming they are going to do it, and see what the countervailing steps are that come out of that. But let's move on to other issues, and not terribly unrelated, Susan. This week, Anthony Blinken made his first trip to the Middle East to try to deal with the conflict that frankly has beset American foreign policy, at least since the 1960s, and in some ways since Harry S. Truman was in the White House. Why did Blinken go, and what did he try to achieve while in the region?
Well, Ivo, I'm glad you made the sort of connection between these two things, because actually I also look at it as there is a sort of through line in terms of dealing with the Russia problem, dealing with the Mideast problem. These are things that the new US administration did not want to put at the top of its foreign policy agenda, while knowing that both Russia and the Mideast have a way of inserting themselves on the foreign policy agenda. They don't like to be pivoted away from, even if successive US administrations have tried. And I feel like that's the context in which you see Tony Blinken there in reactive mode, in a familiar role for the United States, which is that of crisis diplomacy, or at least the immediate aftermath of crisis diplomacy. And in this case, I think it's notable that the 11-day war between Gaza and Israel just concluded did end up finishing in that time frame with a lot of hands-on telephone mediation by President Biden. He had 6 phone calls with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. He, engaged with Egypt as well as Turkey. So did Secretary of State Blinken. But they did not do what the U.S. administration did last time in 2014, which is send a U.S. Secretary of State right into the middle of the missiles flying in the effort to elevate and escalate the diplomacy. And I think that was a very direct lesson from the Obama administration to the Biden administration, which is to say, try not to get sucked into the middle of this. And, frankly, it's an interesting case study right now in, what kind of power is the U.S. going to be able to wield in the Middle East that it is palpably less interested in being obsessed with. And, what is the approach of the Biden team? To me, I take away from this, first of all, very, very modest and limited goals and a real distaste. They're trying to project, these are foreign policy veterans. Not only was Biden himself the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, Tony Blinken, is essentially a career charter member of the Washington foreign policy establishment. Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, same. And these guys know full well that they don't have realistic partners for peace. And the last thing they want is people like us saying, well, now this will bring about a new round of Middle East peacemaking by the Biden team, because they understand that if that is what they're getting sucked into, that they're not likely to succeed. And so this awkward dance, I think, of US policy over time and the contradictions in it is also what we saw. So you have Blinken flying to Israel, meeting also with the Palestinian Authority. But the Palestinian Authority is not in power in Gaza, and saying at the one time, because congressional rules and legislation require that the U.S. is not allowed to give aid directly to the Hamas, which is the controlling power in Gaza. So they're pledging money to, quote, reconstruct Gaza, except giving it to people who have no ability to help reconstruct Gaza. And of course, we're also in what Aaron David Miller, a veteran, peacemaker, calls the rinse and repeat cycle, where we're now also going to be giving money to Israel to replenish the missiles that they just used in the war, so that it'll be ready to do the same thing all over again. And so when people roll their eyes and are weary of another conflict between Gaza and Israel, this is exactly the reason why. And frankly, I don't see anything that suggests a way out. And the one final thing I should note, of course, is there's a huge domestic political context to this in Israel. And it is not obviously an accident or a coincidence that this 11-day war came right as Netanyahu was facing one of the most serious political challenges to his continued rule. He's already the longest serving prime minister of Israel ever. And, he just has faced his 4th election. He once again did not achieve a necessary parliamentary majority. And so the deal making has continued, and he was really on the brink of losing his post finally when this occurred. And so I think it's important for people to understand, that this might, or that Netanyahu might have seen this conflict as a way of strengthening his hand politically inside Israel.
Excellent overview, Susan, and so many important pieces. James, In one of the other attempts that Susan mentioned that Blinken was to sort of to rebalance the U.S. relationship with an outreach to the Palestinians, including more aid, and of course going to Ramallah, spending time in Jordan, a very important player in this, and emphasizing that it's not only Israeli lives but Palestinian lives as well that need to be secured. More closely, I think, to a European view of the conflict. Do you see that as a major beneficial shift that might get us to perhaps a new peace process?
No, I don't. I think actually what you hear in Europe on this is that, yes, there's clearly a tonal shift, and more than a tonal shift, a change in the way in which the US administration is on both sides of this, though, rather than as quite so obviously on one side of it. But what you hear, that if you like, in the last 10 years, the complaint has been that the problem with the peace process is that in neither Abbas nor Netanyahu did you really have leaders that wanted to make a lasting settlement of peace. The question that now you find being asked in Europe is whether or not, given the US agenda on the world stage, if you think about its China issues, if you think about the Russia issues we've just talked about, if you think about the hemisphere issues that the US is facing and climate, does it realistically in this term have plans to make significant progress on Middle East peace? And the reading is no. So there is a sense that the US has moved to a hold position, that it is going to engage meaningfully, obviously still with Netanyahu, but increasingly with the Palestinians. But that's obviously extremely complicated for the reason Susan said, which is you can pour money in, but then you're involved with Hamas. So I don't think there's a sense that there's big momentum in this Biden presidency to commit to a lasting settlement. Of course, the one thing to be said about that is that might be his best card yet. The fact that there's not an expectation and people in the Middle East are aware that there's little upside for the US at the moment to engage in Middle East peace processes perhaps might actually bring the other sides to the table. But to answer your question, I don't think there's a great sense of momentum, Ivo, no.
Ed, to what extent did you see the Blinken trip in domestic political terms? There was a lot of turmoil in the Democratic Party, of course, in response to the 11 days of really major violence on a level we haven't seen, both inside Israel, by the way, of course, between Arab and Jewish community citizens and communities, but also the rocket attacks and the bombardments had a major impact. Do you see this as in part as a response to the criticism, particularly of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, to take Palestinian issues much more seriously than certainly has been the case for a while?
In part, yes. I mean, the Biden administration was clearly working very intensively behind the scenes. They were calling Sisi in Egypt. They were calling Abdullah in Jordan. They were making calls to Israel all day, every day. Jake Sullivan was on the phone. Biden was on the phone. So the impression that he was just sitting there tapping his fingers, Biden, whilst these exchanges were going on between Israel and Gaza, was, I think, false. But it does crystallize this great generational split in the Democratic Party between those who talk, younger generations, and people like Bernie Sanders, it should be mentioned, who talk about an apartheid system in Israel and the double standards of America on this, and those more traditional Democratic voices led by Biden, who take a much more pro-Israeli position and instinctive, we will always support Israel's right to self-defense. I don't remember a time when there were two bills on Congress calling for a ban of arms sales or restriction of arms sales to Israel. Now, neither bill is going to be passed, but both have attracted significant numbers of sponsors from younger Democrats. The split between different generations of Jewish Americans is also particularly interesting because, of course, Netanyahu has essentially, in the last few years, signed up as a Republican. He spoke to Congress against Obama's JCPOA, Iran nuclear deal, which was unprecedented. And he then overtly became a supporter and vice versa of Trump. when Trump was president. So I think because Jewish Americans tend to be more liberal and more democratic voting, this has alienated them from Israel to a degree we've never seen before. And Biden's having to cope with that pressure, but I don't think that's going to result in him appointing an envoy to seek a two-state solution. With leaders like Netanyahu and Mahmoud Abbas, and then of course Hamas in Gaza, this would be a fruitless diversion of time. And there's no reason that it should have any more success than previous efforts.
I think that's also the conclusion that we're hearing from somebody like Martin Indyk, who's been part and parcel of all these conversations for so long, and thinking that the time hasn't come. Ed, sticking with you for a minute and transitioning to our next and final topic, oil, which used to, of course, be all about the Middle East. But what happened this week with big oil, Exxon, Chevron, Shell, all of a sudden, the activists on the climate side are starting to take control. Are we going to look back to this week as the end of big oil and the beginning of climate change becoming the dominant concern, economic, as well as, of course, for other reasons, of large oil companies?
We could well do. I mean, Wednesday was a remarkable day. I mean, we're not just talking about granola eating activists who work for teachers' pension funds in California when it comes, say, to the ExxonMobil action, where two activists were put on the board by this small hedge fund group called Engine Number One. We're talking about people like Larry Fink of BlackRock. We're talking about State Street. We're talking about Vanguard. We're talking about big establishment money being behind these small shareholder activists. So that this is actually a big shareholder activist movement that we're seeing on Wednesday. That was the ExxonMobil case. Chevron also had shareholders. 61% of Chevron's shareholders voted for Chevron to have much tougher carbon emission reduction targets, which for a carbon production company is quite something. And then, of course, this really landmark ruling in the Netherlands that imposed upon Royal Dutch Shell, which accounts for 3%, its own production, 3% of global emissions, imposing an absolute carbon reduction target on them by 2030 of, I think, 45% cut between 2019 output and 2030. This is huge, again, for a company that produces carbon for a living. That's what it does. And Royal Dutch Shell had said previously, look, we're reducing our carbon intensity, which of course is a relative measure. This ruling said, no, in absolute terms, you have to cut that by 45%. And the grounds on which that ruling was made were that climate change pollution affects our human rights. So that opens up a precedent for all kinds of other legal challenges now to companies like Total, BP, etc. within Europe, but also an emboldening event with ExxonMobil, Chevron, and others. I believe there is a shareholder movement in Total to do something similar. For shareholders to say, look, this isn't us being do-gooders. We're saying it's the financial health of your company that is at stake here. That's what persuades me that Wednesday is a landmark day, because this isn't profit versus conscience. This is conscience serves profit. You better get with the game. And the broader context of this is, of course, the COP26 meeting, the big next climate change meeting happening in Glasgow later this year. And that's a very sort of focal point for all these players in the sort of carbon emissions world. The tension is between the West, where all this is happening, and companies like Lukoil in Russia or Aramco in Saudi Arabia or elsewhere, where there aren't really any independent shareholder sort of movements, and courts would rather fold up than issue the kind of ruling we saw in the Netherlands this week. So the question to me is, can that kind of pressure in some way spill over to diplomatic pressure for those countries to get on board too? Or will they just see this as a market opportunity to clean up where, you know, the Exxons and the Royal Dutch Shells are being forced to vacate space?
Critical question, James, both in terms of how do you get others to join, but also is this movement going to continue with BP, with Total, with others? European companies have already started to switch more, I think, than U.S. big oil. You agree this is a big deal, and we can't ignore it?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely enormous, and I think that Ed put his finger on the thing that's most interesting here. I feel like that we're going to run out of time to talk about what's happened in China this week, or in terms of the Wuhan Institute for Virology. It seems to me there are two massive sleeper stories this week. One is the US administration turning its gaze to ask the, gain of function question. Did this COVID-19 pandemic start in a lab? If it did, that is going to absolutely reset things globally. That's a sleeper that starts. And I agree with Ed that the really key thing about the engine number one Exxon story is not how did engine number one get its two people on the board of Exxon. It's how did engine number one get BlackRock on board for its campaign. Because when you start following that logic through and you really think, okay, well, if BlackRock has genuinely got religion around environmental, social, and governance metrics and change within companies, suddenly you're going to see activism that isn't just environmental. You could see activism around human rights. You could see activism around a whole range of social inputs, that you begin to get those big previously passive investors engaged, forcing people onto the boards and forcing a change in company behavior. So the interest to me on engine number one is, okay, will you see this sweep through the Western oil majors? Yes, certainly. And it probably already is. Exxon in some ways was an outlier, actually. The question is, are you going to see it move through other corporates in areas that are not around climate, but around other parts of their social and public outputs?
Well, and that, I think, Susan, and we only got a minute or so left, and we'll leave the Wuhan and the origin of the COVID story for another time. It has political implications, seems to me, in the United States, where the Republican Party, despite is souring on the corporate sector. The Democratic Party, of course, always was soured on the corporate sector, so that politically plus shareholders are now moving against big business. Not only big oil, but this big business. And can one use economic rationales as well as political movement to really start to change the dynamic that frankly has dominated our politics and our economic thinking for the past 100 years?
No, Ivo, I think what we're seeing really is part and parcel of, of what the sort of political hands are calling kind of a supercharged populist movement. And I think that these things are consistent. You see some Republicans, not all of them, understanding that they're want to capitalize on part of what drove the Trump phenomenon and viewing it as, he didn't deliver per se on this populist agenda, but he created and channeled a certain amount of populist energy and rage. And I guess all I would say is, for now, that's not going to happen because the institutional Republican Party remains absolutely committed not only to an extreme partisan view of the world in which defeating the opponent, defeating the Democrats, is more important than any kind of ideological purity. But the other thing is, the lesson that they took away from Trump is that ideology doesn't matter that much. And, they were willing to jettison large swaths of what we associate with the modern Republican Party because that wasn't what was shared by Trump, which, in this analysis was much more about a style of politics and a cult of personality than it was about any particular ideological view. Again, so there exists, I think, this populism in the Republican Party, and yet there also exists, look at the infrastructure bill. What are Republicans saying? They see, and they're terrified, I think, of polls that show how popular it is among Republican as well as Democratic voters to impose vast new corporate taxes to pay for the necessary upgrade and renovation of American infrastructure. And yet the Republican leaders continue to hold to what we might see as an older Republican position of absolutely no way. So I think it's a new fault line in American politics. I think you're absolutely right that these things are all kind of across the board indices of this this fight that's taking place. And I think we don't know the outcome of it yet.
Well, big issue right there for us to come back to. Call it the new politics of winning at any cost. By the way, just to underscore, Ed's got a great column in today's paper, and Susan's weekly column also comes at this the danger of what that kind of politics does to democracy, an issue which I hope we can come back to soon. But I do think we're going to look back at this week with scary and scarier state-sponsored hijacking, challenging the rules of the road, big oil finding that that it can no longer ignore activist investors, and those activist investors are becoming majorities, and the Middle East never goes away. So with that, I wish all of you a terrific weekend. I want to thank James Harding of Tortoise Media, Susan Glasser of the New Yorker, and Ed Luce of the Financial Times for their contribution. Terrific discussion, so many different angles. Looking forward to having you back soon. In the meantime, for all of you watching and listening, have a wonderful Memorial Day weekend, and we'll be back next week with another edition of World Review.
Thank you.
Thank you.